Hello, my name is Madeline Endries, a PhD student at the University of Michigan, and today I'm going to present our paper relating reading, visualization, and coding for new programmers, a neuroimaging study. Now, the title's a bit complicated at first glance, but at a high level, our work uses brain-based imaging to understand what's really going on in novices' heads when they program. Specifically, we investigate if programming for novices is more like reading or if it's more like visualizing shapes, two general cognitive processes that have both been connected to programming in previous studies with expert developers. So first, let's talk a little bit about why I think this work is pretty cool. In general, understanding the cognitive basis for software engineering is important because it can help us understand the cause of observed effects and from this, implement more effective policies and tools. Neuroimaging is a particularly appealing way to study this because, unlike subjective self-reporting, it allows us to objectively measure cognitive activity. Now, several recent neuroimaging studies have helped gain insight into programming. These studies are definitely exciting, and the authors propose that their work could influence many areas of software engineering, including pedagogy, technology transfer, and adult retraining. However, much of this work has been exploratory. Today, we're going to get one step closer to making neuroimaging results actionable through our study of novices and its concrete implications for pedagogy and expertise. Now, in neuroimaging, when you want to understand the cognitive basis of a new task such as programming, you generally compare it to a different, better understood task in something called a contrast-based experiment. The two most common tasks that have been previously compared to programming are spatial reasoning, which can be thought of as the ability to mentally manipulate 3D objects, and reading. One such neuroimaging study by Floyd et al. Used a contrast-based experiment to find with increased programming expertise, programming was actually less distinguishable from reading in the brain. This is intriguing because understanding the cognitive basis of programming expertise could lead to concrete ideas on how to help novices become experts faster. Unfortunately, however, the Floyd study only included developers or students who had already had several years of programming experience, and the observed connection with expertise was exploratory. In fact, all previous software engineering neuroimaging studies have exclusively imaged programmers with years of experience or schooling. In this paper, we help fill this gap through the first neuroimaging study of novice programmers conducting code comprehension. We focus on two main questions. First, we want to understand the cognitive basis of code comprehension for novices. Now, this is a broad question, so to tackle it, we focus on comparing novices' brain activation patterns while coding to those while completing spatial visualization and language-based tasks. We choose these two cognitive tasks because they have been used in previous expert-focused studies. For our second research question, we directly investigate the potentiality for neuroimaging to inform pedagogy through seeing if brain activation patterns captured at the beginning of CS1 can actually predict future programming ability. To answer these questions, we use functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or FNIRS, to capture the brain activity of novice programmers in their first semester of university programming. FNIRS uses light transmitters and receivers in a special cap to measure the brain's blood oxygen levels, and it supports studying the brain while programming in a natural environment. With our high-level plan in mind, let's now move on to experimental design and data collection. To study how new programmers understand code, we recruited our participants from the same Michigan introductory programming class during the third week of the semester, and we conducted brain scans in weeks 4 through 6. Conducting scans at this early point allowed us to study novices who had encountered basic programming syntax but had yet to have much experience actually programming. We also followed up with participants at the end of the semester with a programming test. This test helped us answer our second research question: can brain activation patterns predict future programming ability? With this timeline in mind, let's look at the brain scans themselves in more detail. During the scans, we compared brain activity while participants completed 3 different tasks. For the programming task, we showed participants problems based on topics covered in Michigan's CS1. For spatial visualization, we used mental rotation tasks that are a standard proxy for spatial reasoning. And finally, for reading, we used GRE-style fill-in-the-blank questions. Each participant's scan session, including the setup, lasted 2 hours. As a visual of the study environment, here's my excellent undergraduate researcher, Annie, wearing an FNIRS cap during a pilot scan. All participants were shown 90 stimuli, 30 of each type. We had 31 valid participants, 24 of whom were female. To analyze the data, we used best practices from the psychology literature to compare task-based activation by brain area. Now that we've covered our design and data collection, it's time for the exciting bit, the results. As a quick reminder of our research questions, our first question really gets at the cognitive basis of programming, asking if novices rely more on spatial visualization or language brain areas while programming. Our second question, on the other hand, asks if we can use brain activation patterns to predict future programming ability. So for our first question, do novices rely more on spatial or language areas while programming? We found that the answer is that novices rely more on spatial areas rather than language areas. Specifically, we find more substantial differences between coding and reading than between coding and mental rotation. To help visualize this finding, here are some color-coded heat maps that highlight relevant brain regions with coding versus reading on the left and coding versus mental rotation on the right. Unfortunately, time constraints preclude a thorough discussion of how to read these figures. Some of you may have seen this type of graphic before, but if you haven't, I encourage you to ask me about them after the presentation when I can go through them in more detail. In general, however, more colored dots mean that there are more significant differences, and there are more colored dots in the left picture between coding and reading than in the right picture between coding and mental rotation. This difference in dots is particularly apparent in the right hemisphere and in the frontal cortex. Now, even though programming for novices seems more similar to spatial visualization than to reading, we do find that coding is distinct from both of them. In particular, we find that for novices, coding is cognitively demanding as we see stronger working memory activation than for either other task. Okay, so we found that for novices, programming looks more like spatial visualization than like reading. Great, but why do we care? Our results help answer this question by providing support for changes in pedagogical practice. In contrast with previous studies with experts, we find less cognitive similarity between reading and programming. This finding has implications for developer training and pedagogy. At the bottom of the slide, I have briefly outlined one way our findings could influence practice. In learning theory, spatial reasoning is sometimes viewed as a general problem-solving toolbox. Thus, the observed convergence of programming and reading through expertise may be caused by programmers learning domain-specific strategies that use more reading-associated cognitive processes. If this is true, directly training reading-based domain-specific strategies may help novices become experts faster. In other fields, people have used similar neuroimaging results to influence training in this way. So to summarize research question 1, we found that for novices, spatial reasoning is more similar to programming than reading at a cognitive level. This is in contrast to results with expert developers and has implications for future programming, training, or interventions. Moving on to research question 2, can brain activation patterns captured at the start of CS1 predict future programming ability? To answer this question, we conduct an exploratory study where we correlate brain activity interactions on the 3 tasks with scores on the programming post-test. Doing so, we find that, yes, it is possible to use brain scans to predict performance. Specifically, we find that less similar patterns of activation for coding and mental rotation in the right frontal hemisphere at the start of the semester predict better outcomes on the end of semester programming assessment. This analysis is exploratory, so we can't yet say why less similar patterns of activation for coding and mental rotation predict better performance. One possibility that aligns with the implications discussed in research question 1 is that novices who transition earlier away from general spatial skills to reading-associated domain-specific strategies ultimately actually make more progress. This result, therefore, provides impetus for earlier pedagogical interventions in computer science. Finally, on a bit of a separate note, I want to be clear that we do not see our results as supporting essentialist-based theories of programming ability. Rather, we think they provide insight for more effectively understanding and removing computing barriers. However, if you want to talk more about the ethical considerations behind using medical imaging to predict performance, definitely ask me during the discussion. So in summary, for research question 2, we found that, yes, novice brain activity when programming can predict future programming ability. This finding provides another window into understanding and ameliorating computing barriers. In conclusion, in this paper we conducted a study of 31 novice programmers where we found that programming is a challenging, working memory-intensive task. We also found that spatial reasoning is more similar to programming than reading for novices, and that programming brain activity can predict future programming ability weeks later. Our results have implications for bettering the training of future programmers and software engineers, and our materials and replication package are available on the link in the box. Thank you for attending, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. If you just joined us during the last presentation, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Carolyn Seaman, and I am the session chair for this session on observational studies of developers. And I have with me Madeline, who you just heard give her talk, as well as one of her co-authors, Wesley, who's here as well for moral support and backup. So please think about your questions that were prompted by Madeline's talk and put them in the chat. And I will take advantage of there not being any there yet and ask some of my questions, if you don't mind. So I'll start with your research question 2, your results that address research question 2. And I wonder, could they be explained by some of your participants being students who actually had prior programming experience before they came to college? That is, those are students who started a little further along the path from coding being like spatial reasoning to coding being like reading. So that similarity, so that path that they were a little further along when they started as first-year students.
So that's a really great question. And one thing we actually did with the study was we were very careful to select novices who didn't have incoming prior programming experience. And now this is something that's super tricky to do, because if you just ask someone if they have prior programming experience, half of them will say yes or no, depending, maybe they've had an HTML course. Does that count as prior programming experience? Is a Scratch course prior programming experience? So we basically were very upfront at the beginning about what counted, what didn't. We had to do a couple different levels of questionnaires. And then we also did kind of a statistical validation on a test, a programming test at the beginning of the whole semester that they took. And let's just say they did not do significantly better than random on this test. So while we can't have 100% confidence that they didn't have incoming ability, we're about as close as we can be.
Okay. That's very interesting. I've run into that too, and I sometimes teach a first-year programming course, and I try to get a sense of who's had prior programming experience. And I find the answers are all over the place and bear no resemblance to reality. So I was wondering about that. That's part of the reason that question came up.
Yeah.
And another question that came up in my head, again, somewhat reflective of my own experience in writing studies, is what kinds of protections or supports or mechanisms did you have to include in your research design in order to get approval from your IRB, from your ethics board? I assume some of these participants were minors. What did you have to do differently since you were being so invasive and there were such young students?
So we actually, you're very on point about the minor thing. We had one of our basically pre-screening questions was, were you 18? Because you can do studies with minors, but there are a lot more ethical considerations that come into effect. And we had a big enough sample size to draw from while making that particular rule up front. But yes, IRB and ethics, when you're working with humans, is always paramount. And with this particular study, we're getting sensitive information. It's not as sensitive as something like fMRI, where you get detailed structures of the brain, but you're still getting brain activation patterns from participants. And so a big thing for our IRB approval was data storage. And so all of our data is stored on basically a secure, doubly protected hard drive sort of thing. And we also, for sharing the data, we have stripped all IDs from it, and we don't post it directly online. So if you're interested in the data for doing some sort of collaboration or using it for something further on, please reach out to us, and we'll be able to share it with you going through more channels to ensure participant safety.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah. So there's a question from Dragos, who asked, what is the reason behind choosing NIRSI, NIRSI, I don't know if that's how you say it, as an imaging modality?
So again, another great question. And I think when you're choosing an imaging modality, you have, for software engineering in particular, you kind of have a set of trade-offs. And one of these trade-offs is ecological validity. So if you have something like fMRI, you're going to get more detailed information, but you're going to also have participants who are basically lying in a tube trying to program like down at their knees. It's not at all reflective. But with FNIRS, we kind of get less of that detail. However, they're allowed to basically sit at a desk and type at a desk. And so you really have that trade-off. And so we went for more ecological validity. And also, this is just something for people who want to do these sort of studies. Generally, FNIRS is a lot less expensive to perform from like a funding-based bit. This isn't specific to every institution, but at our institution, it's about a factor of 10 more expensive. So it really just depends on the study and the goals, and if your research questions can be answered with one or the other.
Thank you. Grant has a question. Are there similar studies that you know for things like learning how to read music or learn a new natural language?
So this is like a great question, and this actually gets me super excited. So first, the music thing. The answer is not really. Well, there are in non-CS fields. So definitely looking about how to learn music, but connecting it to CS, definitely not. And it's something that I would love to look into. So my background is actually half in music, half in CS. I have 2 undergrads and one of them's in music. And so this is something that I think is really cool and definitely would like to look into. Natural language, there are definitely more studies, especially connecting to CS. And actually, this is kind of a spoiler for a paper that, well, hopefully it's currently conditionally accepted, but hopefully will be accepted to FSE, which we did some follow-on work to this. And we basically did a training using basically technical reading strategies to see if that could help novices get better at CS. And the answer seems to be yes. So that will be pretty cool stuff to look forward to.
All right. We have a question from Norman who asks, do you think there are other cognitive processes besides reading and mental rotation that could be a component of programming ability?
Absolutely. This is an area that, program comprehension itself is a very rich area, but specifically medical imaging of programming is a fairly new sort of field, and there's a lot of areas to look into. And then there's a lot of additional factors beyond just purely cognitive factors, things like self-efficacy or other like internal like biases or attitudes. So the answer is absolutely yes. Spatial reading and reasoning are the 2 that have been most studied thus far, but I think there's a lot of room out there for further investigation.
Thank you. I have another question that I'm curious about. Was your recruitment strategy? How did you convince people to do this? And were there any incentives or I don't know, Madison Avenue advertising strategies, recruitment strategies that you used to get people to do this? And what was sort of of your population of first-year students that you could reach? How many of them did agree to do this?
Gotcha. So I will say for the amount that we were able to reach, we weren't limited by our population size. We were limited by the number of scans we could run within basically 2 to 3 weeks, because we wanted to get everyone around the same time. And each scan takes an hour and a half to say 2 hours with buffer time. And so we basically had 3 weeks of 80 hours per week trying to get all of these scans stuffed in. But for our whole like recruitment strategy, we kind of talked to the professor of our Computer Science 101 course, and Michigan is a really big institution. So our incoming CS1 class has, I don't know, 900, 1,000 students in it, something in that ballpark. And basically the professor let me come into each of the different lectures and give a spiel. And after that point, they had to sign up onto a pre-screening form. And then from that, we started doing, say, selections for our pre-screening qualifiers and all of these different sort of things. We did have an incentive for each scan. Every participant was compensated $20, US dollars.
Mm-hmm. Did you pre-screen for diversity to get a balanced sample in terms of gender and race and other things like that?
So we did not do anything besides age and prior programming experience. We did, as it turned out, actually get a sample that is majority woman, which is interesting and fairly unusual for CS. There's a couple reasons for this. One is that it's intro CS, and at Michigan, that's a higher percentage of women, so it's around 45%, but also our requirement that there was no prior programming experience leaned the sample more towards women. And also just in general, women tend to volunteer more for studies. It's been shown in, say, like different areas of like clinical psychiatry and that sort of thing.
Oh, that's very interesting. All right, we have just a few seconds left. Any last questions? There will be, just as this session is ending, as most of you probably already know, there will be a little box pop up to go into a discussion room, and I will be shooing Madeline and